2018 Minnesota 1st Congressional District Candidate Forum. Today, Republican candidate Jim Hagedorn and Democrat candidate Dan Feehan discuss issues important to southern Minnesota at South Central College in Mankato. This open seat is up for grabs. Join us for the next 90 minutes as we hear firsthand from candidates seeking to represent Minnesota's 1st Congressional District. The 2018 1st Congressional District Candidate Forum is hosted by Greater Mankato Growth, the Free Press, and South Central College, and is brought to you by KSMQ Public Television in partnership with Bethany Lutheran College and KTV Public Access. And now, from South Central College, the 2018 Minnesota 1st Congressional District Candidate Forum.
Good afternoon. My name is Annette Parker, and I'm honored to serve as the president of South Central College, a proud Minnesota State college here in North Mankato. We're honored to serve tonight and be the host of this debate. And, you know, at South Central College, we work with our students around civic engagement. And so I hope that some of our students and faculty and staff are in the audience tonight as we have taught them through civic debate and in a respectful way that we can help to keep our country strong. And those are the values that we instill in our college throughout our college with our faculty, staff, and students. So we're honored to be our host tonight for this very important event. I'd like to thank the Free Press and Greater Mankato Growth for giving us the opportunity to be tonight's host. And so please enjoy yourself and enjoy South Central College. And with that, I'd like to introduce Patrick Baker from GMG.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. And good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Baker, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President for Greater Mankato Growth. I want to thank you for attending this evening's forum between the candidates vying to represent Minnesota's 1st Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. This forum is presented by Greater Mankato Growth, the Free Press, and South Central College. I want to thank South Central College for hosting us this evening and allowing us to use this great space. Additionally, I'd like to thank KSMQ Public TV for live broadcasting this evening's forum, and I'd like to thank KTV for live streaming this event online. Before I address some housekeeping items for tonight's forum, I want to let you know about our other upcoming candidate forums that Greater Mankato Growth is hosting this month. Later this week, on Wednesday evening, will be a forum for Minnesota House District 19A with Jeff Brand and Kim Spears. October 24th will be a forum for Minnesota House District 19B with Representative Jack Considine and Joe Steck. In addition, Greater Mankato Growth and KTV are hosting in-studio forums for Mankato Mayor, City Council, and the Blue Earth County Board of Commissioners. You can get more information on all of these forums, as well as links to the video recordings, by going to greatermankato.com/forum. Now, turning to tonight's forum. First, I'd like to set out a few expectations for our audience to help us present an engaging and civil dialogue this evening. We have more questions, significantly more questions than we have time for, so we ask that you help us make the most of our time by holding your applause until the end of the forum, and that there be no shouting or heckling, particularly of the moderators. This evening's format is as follows. Each candidate will be allowed 3 minutes to make opening and closing remarks. And our moderators will hold each candidate to approximately 2-minute responses to our Q&A. This evening, we're more interested in engaging in robust discussion and getting these candidates' thoughts on an issue. So it may take longer in some instances. Any follow-up questions or discussion will be at the discretion of our moderators. And speaking of moderators, I'm pleased to be joined this evening by Steve Jameson, who's the publisher of the Mankato Free Press, who is serving as our co-moderator this evening. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce the candidates for this evening's forum. Dan Feehan is the DFL candidate, and Jim Hagedorn is the Republican candidate. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Hagedorn to present your opening statement. Mr. Hagedorn.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate all the folks for putting this on. Dan, looking forward to a spirited debate. Glad you're here. You may remember me as the guy that almost beat Tim Walz in the last election. We had 49.6% of the vote. We'll get back to that in just a second. But I am Jim Hagedorn, the Republican candidate for Congress here in Minnesota's 1st District. I'm a product of this district, of this part of southern Minnesota. Born in Blue Earth, Minnesota, where I reside today. Raised on a grain and livestock farm just outside of Truman. And that's where I went to school, parochial school and everything. Those were my roots. My father, Tom Hagedorn, who used to represent this area in Congress, my grandfather and great-grandfather, all southern Minnesota farmers. I've had some wonderful experiences in my life, both here in southern Minnesota and the national level. For a time, I worked for Congressman Arlen Stanglin of Minnesota. It was a great experience during the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s to be on Capitol Hill. With Arlen, we did some good things. We reformed the 1968 Gun Control Act to bring firearms rights back to the American people. We handled work for welfare legislation, and we did lots of other good things that we'll talk about later. I also had the experience of being a Congressional and Legislative Affairs Director for 2 Treasury agencies, and I guess my claim to fame is I'm one of the very few people in the history of the country who went out to Washington without any political power and downsized my own federal agency, put a bill through Congress that closed check writing centers, eliminated 5% of our agency's workforce, and saved the taxpayers $2 billion. That's a pretty good experience, I think, for this job. Like I said, in 2016, we had 49.6% of the vote against Tim Walz. You know, and we wanted to win that race. We were only 2 votes per precinct away from making it happen. If just 2 votes per precinct, they switched from Tim to Jim, we win. That's how close it was. But, you know, as much as we wanted to win, the next day I woke up a very happy American. Because you see, our race for Congress, it wasn't the most important one on the ballot. The most important one on the ballot was for President of the United States. And I truly believe that had Hillary Clinton won, she would have stacked the court with radicals who would have taken away many of our basic liberties. I think we would have lost the country the way the forefathers put it together. I'm very proud of the direction of the country is moving today. This race for Congress is one of the most important in the country. This is truly one of the few where the Republicans have a chance to take back a Democrat seat at this point. And this may be the difference in which direction our country moves over the next 2 years. The first vote that either Dan or I will cast in the U.S. House is the most important vote that we will cast the first 2 years in Congress, to decide who organizes the U.S. House, which party will be in power. If Dan wins, he's going to vote for a Democrat. And the Democrats are going to organize and take their very liberal people, like Maxine Waters and the rest of them, and they're going to resist President Trump. They're going to try to impeach President Trump, and they're going to try to take us back to the Obama days and then some, far to the left. If I win, I will vote for a Republican. And what we will do is try to cooperate with our president to keep moving our country in the right direction. My goals are to keep America safe with secure borders, to make sure that we don't transform America into some European socialist state, like the Democrats want to do, but reform our government to keep the economy moving with high-wage jobs. My goal is also to protect our God-given rights and to sustain agriculture and our rural way of life. I look forward to addressing the issues as we move forward, and I look forward to a spirited debate, and I hope we'll both be straightforward with you as we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hagedorn. Mr. Feehan, your opening statement.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Steve, to our moderators, Dr. Parker as well, and to our host here tonight. It's nice to not have to travel far for campaigning, for a change. My name is Dan Feehan. Live here in North Mankato, just down the street. My son Connor is a Hoover Husky, even closer to here, and I'm proud to be a Southern Minnesotan, up for the chance to represent Southern Minnesota. I grew up in Red Wing, and I grew up with the spirit and sense of what Southern Minnesota is. It's a place where everyone does their part. It's a place where people step forward, and it's a place where people get things done in spite of disagreements. And it's that spirit of service that drives me to run for Congress, because I've lived my life by it. I joined the Army after 9/11. I served 2 combat tours in Iraq, searching for roadside bombs, trying to capture insurgents, and working with a platoon full of soldiers more diverse than this country itself, but we still got things done. When I came back to the country here, I became a middle school math teacher, which by some accounts was even more challenging than that first experience. But again, it was an incredible impact to have on kids, and kids in places where their zip code determines where they go in life. These experiences gave me the wisdom needed to serve in Congress today. And they're with the idea that whatever happens in Washington, D.C., and especially when nothing gets done, it's a matter of life and death. That's what policy is for people. And when you're in a tough experience of public service, you have to work with people you don't agree with. That's what life is, and that's what service has to be. And I believe politics is public service, and that's why I'm running to do this, just that. We have a challenge in Washington, D.C. It is a broken and dysfunctional place, and we have a need right now for a check and balance. That means someone who's willing to work with the president when it benefits Southern Minnesota, but someone who's willing to stand up to him when it doesn't. That's how our Congress was designed, an independent body of government, and I'm running to be an independent voice. I don't take money from corporate PACs because I don't believe corporations should tell someone how to vote. And I'm not beholden to party leadership because I don't believe your party should tell you how to vote. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution as an Army officer. That's the same oath you take in Congress, to put your country above party. That's what I believe we need right now, because Southern Minnesotans deserve to tackle the challenges that we have ahead of us, whether it's healthcare, whether it's our economy, and so many more we're going to talk about tonight. You've already heard a little bit from my opponent tonight, and I'll say this much. He's trying to portray the idea that I am someone just as partisan as he is. Well, I reject that. And you're going to hear from someone who tries to portray my positions as different from his in a way that is almost antithetical to the idea. And I reject that as well. I'm running to be an independent voice to be able to represent all of Southern Minnesota. Those are the stakes of this. So I reject that idea of politics, because that's why Washington is as broken as it is, because that's what it is represented by right now. We deserve something different. I hope for the honor of your support, but I hope for a lively discussion tonight. Thank you for participating in the future of Southern Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feehan. And the first question will go to you, Mr. Feehan, will be asked by Mr. Jameson.
Well, this question is for both of you. And I think it's a question that gets to sort of the core of both of your philosophies. Please describe what you think is a proper role of the federal government in today's society and what you believe are the core responsibilities of a U.S. representative within that system.
Yeah, I believe that the core function of Congress and the core responsibility of governing is to enable the principles with which this country is founded on, and that's the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the idea. And government's role, I believe, is to make sure that people are free to pursue those things. That's the idea of it. So when I think about an issue like healthcare, I hope a challenge that we get to talk about at length tonight, I believe that the broken healthcare system right now prohibits people from being free to be healthy. It prohibits your pursuit of happiness when you don't have adequate health care or don't have any health care at all, for example. And the role of Congress in all of this is simple. It is designed brilliantly to be one of three equal, co-equal branches of government. That's what Congress's role is, and that is what it is failing to do right now. It's failing to do it because it is hyper-partisan, and it's failing to do it because many members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, aren't beholden to the people they represent. They're beholden to corporate special interests. I know this because I watched it happen. I watched members of the Democratic Party and Republican Party be beholden to those things, be beholden to party leaderships. And I'm running in the spirit of being someone of a different generation. I'm a millennial. Congress is unrepresented by that. And I believe the spirit and philosophy of governance should be that there is representation from all parts of America. That's the idea of it. And I believe it is time for a new generation of leadership to be in Washington, D.C., to represent the issues that are on the ground. At the end of the day, our country's government is to be there to make sure people can pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that they were entrusted with hundreds of years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Feehan. Mr. Hagedorn.
The primary responsibility of anybody who's serving in Washington, D.C. as an elected official is to make sure that the country's protected and the people are protected. That's the number one responsibility of the federal government. And that's what I would take for the job. I say, everybody, what's your purpose, your primary purpose? Make sure that the country's secure, our military is second to none, and that the people are protected. Beyond that, as far as what I believe the powers of the federal government should be, as limited as possible. The best way to give people freedom and liberty over their own lives, make their own decision making, is to make sure that the federal government doesn't usurp that unnecessarily. And in many areas that they have. And there'll be some discussions tonight about the differences in our philosophy. I don't believe, for instance, we should move towards socialized medicine. I think that's a bad idea. I think we should move back towards free market medicine and give you choices. When it comes to the tax code, how do you take the power from Washington and send it back to you? You make sure that you, through the tax code, can save, spend, invest, hold your own money the way you want to, not the way the bureaucrats, the interest groups, and the politicians tell you. What about our veterans? What's the best way to empower them from the federal government? Give them a choice. Let the veterans choose their own doctors and hospitals and have a choice between the VA system and the private sector. That's what I stand for. Those are the types of things that I would do. As far as what a congressperson is supposed to do in this role, represent the people. But that doesn't necessarily mean you put your finger in the wind and decide what everybody's believing at a certain point. I'm going to be honest with you tonight and tell you exactly where I stand on the issues. I'm going to offer you solutions to the challenges facing this country. I'm going to let you know what I want to do with the job. By the time you leave here, you may not agree with everything that I've said, but you'll know where I stand. I don't believe that's going to be the same with my opponent. We've had 3 debates now, and he very much doesn't want to tell you where he's coming from. And if he doesn't, I guess I'll have to. But that's, I think, going to be a big difference in this debate tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Hagedorn. And you will have the first response to this next question. It's on agriculture. Agriculture remains the bedrock of communities in the 1st District, and not just typical production farming. More than 800 agriculture-associated industries, everything from transportation and distribution to professional services, ag-related manufacturing and processing, research and education, employ nearly 100,000 individuals across southern Minnesota, nearly 28% of our workforce. However, agriculture and agribusiness face compounding challenges like an aging workforce, shrinking rural communities, depressed commodity prices, and outdated infrastructure. What should Congress be doing to better support the growth of the agriculture economy in our region?
Well, this is a very important point and question. It's personal for me, having grown up on a farm and being part of agriculture. I want to serve on the U.S. House Agriculture Committee and do 3 main things. One is make sure that we have good government policies that in any way possible push down the cost of production agriculture, push down the input cost of farming. We do that in a number of ways. Regulatory reform, so the Congress decides which regulations hit the farmers. We do it by getting rid of this Obamacare and going towards free market, because Obamacare has been crushing agriculture and farmers and agribusinesses for 5 years. It's been the biggest issue in agriculture up until we got into the trade issue. Thirdly, what we need to do is make sure we have work for welfare and things like that, so some of our farms and operations have a workforce out there. Move them out there as best as possible. And then have an energy policy that keeps downward pressure on the cost of energy, because energy is very important for agriculture, not just transportation and everything, but actual production. About 40% of the cost of producing a bushel of corn is energy. So those would be the types of things that I would do on the input cost side. Secondarily, we have to have programs in place to make sure that when times are tough, we can sustain farmers through that, sustain agriculture, keep them going. That's really important, because when farmers sell out, when they have to sell out, generally speaking, they sell out to larger operators. Larger operators are not bad people, but what it means is fewer people holding the land, fewer people working the land, fewer people living in our communities, going to our schools and so forth, puts enormous pressure on our small communities, on our rural part of southern Minnesota. Lastly, and this is very important, I'd be someone that would support agreements, trade agreements that would help us expand our markets and drop down barriers. President Obama came through and he wanted to do the TPP. I supported that. It was a bipartisan thing. I said that at Farm Fest. I would vote for that. I don't know if Dan would vote for that. He's never answered the question. But we have to do everything we can to make sure that there's a market for the finest agricultural products in all the world produced right here. Now, what's going on with trade right now is President Trump, when he was running for president, said China was cleaning our clocks. China was out there stealing our intellectual property. They were getting the best of us on the trade deals. They were manipulating their currency. And he'll talk a lot about the trade war with China. But the fact of the matter is, we've had a trade war with China for 20 years, but they've been the only ones fighting. Presidents Bush and Obama looked the other way. Finally, we have a person that's standing up to him. He also said he wanted to reset things with Mexico and Canada. Already done. We've made gains for our farmers. That's good. We have agreements in place with the European Union. That's good for our farmers. Korea, that could be good for agriculture. So we're making progress in these things. There's going to be a little transition, a little bit of rough turbulence, but in the end, we're going to drop down these barriers, expand our markets, and I believe what the president is doing in the end game is going to be very helpful for farmers and agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Hagedorn. Mr. Feehan.
And this is a critical question for all of us, because whether or not you are part of the ag economy, it impacts you. As it grows or as its growth is stunted, it's going to impact all of us in the future of southern Minnesota, because this is the driver of our economy. And the way I think about this, there's an enormous role for Congress to play. First, it starts with the idea that right now we are living without a farm bill. And the idea that longer that goes on, that impacts all of us, because that's uncertainty added to the world of our farmers right now when they need it the least. So that's article number one, because it's very possible that the next Congress has to take it on. But then secondly, something I hear consistently, the idea of an aging workforce. Let's talk about getting young people into farming. And that doesn't mean they are farmers themselves, but they are part of the broad technology that's expanding as part of this too. And there's barriers to entry for young people right now to get into farming. And we have to make sure we're doing everything possible. I'm a former middle school teacher. A 5th and 6th grader is open to the opportunities that are presented in front of them. And we need to make sure that we are partnering with every single school district to make sure kids know about great programs that exist at places just like right here at this college. Those opportunities are out there, but if we aren't talking to our kids about those opportunities, we lose out and the workforce becomes smaller and smaller along the way. But we do have to talk about trade as part of this, because the best way that we can make sure our economy here, our ag economy grows, is to not stunt it in the first place. So we do have to talk about this trade war, because this isn't a matter of patience. I sat at Farm Fest next to my opponent who delivered this message that our farmers just need to be patient right now at this bigger, broader mission. This isn't the idea about China. We can have that discussion, and we can talk about what we can do to make sure China is held accountable. But I do not accept the idea that we here in southern Minnesota take the brunt of this trade war, that we are the ones taking one for the team. Because again, at the end of the day, that impacts all of us. And with the uncertainty around climate change, something that my opponent has sat next to me 3 times and denied as even a reality, is something that we have to acknowledge too. Because our economy depends on growth to the markets that farmers opened up in the first place, and it depends on research so that our crops can withstand the changes that climate change brings along with it, including increasingly wetter and wetter seasons along the way. But the only way that's going to happen is if you aren't beholden to the party leadership that's part of the president right now, because the president's made a choice. Hey, we're going to make these changes, and you in southern Minnesota are going to have to take the brunt of it. I don't accept that. We have to have someone who's willing to stand up to that, to stand up right here now, because some farmer right now who has to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to make it next year, isn't faced with the idea of being patient. They're faced with the idea of whether or not they continue at all. And that adds to the complicated factors we have here, because this is the heart of who we are. And I know that not just because I detasseled corn as a kid, but I know that because this is complicated stuff. And what's happening right now to our economy constitutes a government intervention. And that's something farmers don't like at all. Farmers have opened these markets on their backs, and we should get out of the way and allow those markets to continue to thrive and end this trade war. Congress has a role to play.
Yeah. Okay. We all get that these are trying times, but the president has a plan and he's negotiating. We have to give him a little bit of a runway to get it done. I think he's already shown a lot of progress. But whether or not you agree with that, let's just set the table here. First of all, every 5 years we go over the farm bill. This is nothing new. That happens all the time. They'll get it straightened out. We'll work it out. But the second thing is this. Farmers in southern Minnesota and across the country have experienced low commodity prices and high input costs for a number of years, going back to the middle of the Obama administration. They've been squeezed for a lot of reasons. And most of it was because, and it's my contention, the Democrats under Obama had a war against agriculture in every respect. Regulations coming out of the EPA were onerous. People like Cullen Peterson, the Democrat up in the 7th District, will tell you that. Waters of the United States, not a good thing. Even in Minnesota, these buffer strips that the governor was imposing on the farmers, not good. Obamacare taking $20,000 or $30,000 out of farmers' pockets when they're losing money or breaking even, not good. Then you get into things like this energy policy under Obama, driving up the cost, really hurting farmers. Dodd-Frank, there were aspects of that. That was just Obamacare for banks, not good for farmers. So this idea that, oh, Donald Trump came into power, the Republicans came into power, that sounds very partisan to me, and now all the farmers are in trouble because of that? No. We're trying to fix it. We're trying to drive down these input costs, help farming and agriculture in the long run, and I think that's a big reason why farmers and agribusinesses and others supported Donald Trump and supported our campaign, and I think they will in this election as well. I ask for their vote.
This is the only reflection I have based on hearing that. At some point in southern Minnesota, and this isn't going to be just one case, farmers will lose their farms on account of what's happening right now. And you as a representative have to be able to look them in the face and say that you did everything possible to prevent that from happening, to prevent those markets from closing, or not. I'd be willing to be able to stand in front of any farmer right now and say that I advocated for every single one of them to be able to have the free enterprise that they are endowed with. That's not the case if you simply just support a president's policies here that are hurting us and hurting us directly. That's the point of an independent body of government, to be at the table, to make the case as hard as you can so that we don't have to take the brunt of this.
Thank you. We're going to move on to everybody's favorite topic, taxes. Last year, Congress passed sweeping changes in the U.S. tax code and cut taxes significantly. How do you view this new law? What will be your tax priorities if elected? And how do we deal with a U.S. debt that's projected to be over $1 trillion next year?
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. This comes up a lot. This has come up in our debates as well. And it comes up with the idea of being misleading. Because I believe tax reform needed to happen and should have happened, but it happened in the wrong way. And so it still needs to happen. And that means directly impacting the middle class, first and foremost, being the top priority, not our millionaires and billionaires. But what we got right now, it was flipped the other way around. The millionaires and billionaires got the lion's share, and the middle class was expected to deal with what was left along the way. My opponent has sat there 3 times next to me and told all of the people listening just how great a tax benefit this was. And he said, on average, it's $2,000 in tax cuts. But this is a great opportunity because I used to be a middle school math teacher, and you get to provide a lesson on the difference between an average and a median. Because if you look at this tax bill, the median was far, far lower, yet you're being told on average it's $2,000. That's the misleading part of this. The idea that the wealthiest, if you're a millionaire, you got a $69,000 tax cut. That's the misleading that's happening along the way. Because people every single day that I talk to who are struggling because wages have stagnated, because they're working 2 and 3 jobs, they're paying for child care, elder care, deserve far better than that. And that's the type of tax reform that will lead to in Congress. Because the worst part of this is the idea that it added to our debt. $1.9 trillion and it's at its greatest estimate. Think of that, and think of who's going to bear the cost of it. I think about my own kids along the way with it. Because the idea that what's being risked right now is Social Security and Medicare on account of it, with no plan is to fix that in the first place. So I am for tax reform, and I hope the next Congress gets a chance to do it right when it should have been done that way in the first place.
I'll start backwards. I mean, I'm for reforming all the federal agencies of government, something that I'd like to get out there and work with members of Congress to get done. I think we can grind out a lot of savings across government. We can look at every program, determine what makes sense and how best to meet the needs of the American people. There's only so much money, though, in the budget as it stands. I think the only way we're going to deal with our debt is to grow ourselves out of it. You know, we had an administration where we never had economic growth in 1 year over 3%. That's unacceptable. It's the first time it's happened in like the history of the country, basically, and certainly in modern times. And if we don't grow our economy, we're not going to expand our revenues, and we're not even going to be in a position to be fiscally responsible to take that money and apply it to the debt in order to lower the cost and what's going on with the people. So from that standpoint, we have to grow the economy. That's my view. This tax cut was a business tax cut. I said that from the beginning. I understand it was mostly a corporate and business tax cut. It was designed to get the economy moving, make sure capital was moving, have capital formation. And to that degree, look, things are working. Things are working. The construction trades are rolling. Businesses are rolling. The market's up. I mean, there's a lot of growth in the economy, and that's a good thing. Unemployment is at record low levels. You have lots of folks in the economy who haven't done well in the past who are doing pretty good now. And that's good. Do we need to do better? Yes. We need to have individual tax reform. We need a code that, again, allows you to save, spend, invest, hold your own money the way you see fit. One of the proposals that I have out there that would allow people to spend money for education, health insurance, medical care, tax-free. Nobody pays federal tax on that money. That would be the biggest tax cut that most people in the middle, not the very rich, not the very poor, received. I think that's a good idea. That's where we need to go. But as far as, every member of Congress needs to step up and say, how do we reform the government? What do we do to save money? And I have ideas, and we'll talk about those, but one of them is very simple. People can't believe this, but you, the taxpayers, you actually pay the federal workers in Washington to go to and from work every day. Believe it or not. They get to do that tax-free. They don't even pay taxes on that benefit, $3,000 a year. Get rid of that, let them pay their own way. That's $500 million right there. If every member of Congress came up with $500 million to save, we could balance the budget.
Thank you. Next question. We've touched on this already tonight, and that is healthcare. A recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll found that 54% of Americans support the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, the highest since the law's passage. The number of uninsured Americans has dropped since enactment of this law, but despite this success, health insurers are concerned about the Affordable Care Act's financial sustainability, and Americans are experiencing dramatic increases in health insurance premiums. How would you propose to improve healthcare? And Mr. Hagedorn, you're the first up.
Now, by the way, I misspoke, and last you would not balance the budget if every member of Congress came up with $500 million. I just wanted to clarify that. So here's the deal. Minnesota didn't need Obamacare. Minnesota had a system in place with 94% of the people covered with an insurance card, and we had a system for people with pre-existing expensive medical needs. We didn't need Obamacare. When Tim Walz and the rest of them voted for that, it was very partisan. There were no Republican votes for Obamacare. Guess what happened? Destroyed the insurance market, destroyed the doctor-patient relationship, forced people to pay exorbitant premiums with deductibles so high the insurance is worthless, basically, for most people. And then you shifted millions of people in the country from private insurance to public insurance, government-subsidized insurance. So there's a lot of people running around with an insurance card, but they don't have medical care because they can't afford the deductibles, and they can't afford, they just can't afford to go to the doctor. People are putting off things. It has been a disaster. Now, the Democrats, what they want to do from here is take disaster and make it worse. Socialized medicine. That's their game. That's where they're going. Single payer, the whole 9 yards, whatever. And that I hope we talk one more round, because that would devastate our economy, would hurt cities just like this, Rochester, destroy medicine as we know it, drive up our taxes. It'd be really bad. Now, here's what I think should happen. We need to get back to free market principles. And free market principles mean this to me. People should pay for their routine medical care. When you go to the doctor, get an MRI, things like that, you should be able to have an account with pre-tax dollars to pay for those things. And that way, everyone has incentive to shop, to make sure that they have healthy living, because you get to keep your own money. Now you say, well, how could you shop? Right now, it's impossible. We need price transparency. I'm looking at a representative from the local area, Mr. Munson, who's been working on that up in St. Paul. We need that nationally, so people know what it costs to go to the doctor or get an MRI or things before they go, not after. If we have shopping in the system, now we can put downward pressure on costs. People can make their own decisions. Secondly, we need major medical. So if you have a very expensive one-time problem, you're covered with a deductible. It makes sense. You can do that. The market will adjust. We can do this reasonably. Third, we need a high-risk pool for people with expensive medical needs to make sure that they get the care that they need, timely quality medical care. Nobody goes broke. Everybody's covered. And if that sounds familiar, it's pretty much what we had in Minnesota before Obamacare.
This has been the #1 campaign topic that people have brought up, whether or not Republican, Independent, Democrat, they bring up health care. And it's important to talk, we're talking about cost in the system, but it's also important to talk about accessibility too. The system we have is broken, and I think of no more of the brokenness of it right now, of why the status quo isn't working, than a conversation I had while at Farm Fest. I talked to the spouse of a farmer. The family's on the individual market right now. 2 of the kids had the flu, so they went to the doctor. They paid $750 out of pocket to get treated. And her reaction to that wasn't just the shock of the cost. Her reaction to that was to change her behavior entirely. And she said, you know what, next time, we just won't go. In this country, tens of thousands of people died of the flu last year. And that's when we're in a place where people are becoming their own doctor because of the cost is so enormous. That broken system, that status quo cannot be accepted any longer. But I reject the idea of going backwards. I reject the idea of going to a place where insurance companies dictated who did and who did not have insurance. I reject going back to the place where millions of people less had insurance in the first place. I'm of the mind of we move forward on this. And it's with the idea, let's talk about that same mother that I talked to. Let's talk about the idea of a public option being introduced right here that people can buy into, that's simply cheaper than what's out there on the private market right now. Let's use that principle of free enterprise and force that private market that makes a buck off of our health or sickness to get cheaper, to get more comprehensive, because they have no incentive to do so right now. And one of the reasons they have no incentive to do so right now is, again, because of the money involved. Corporate PAC money impacts insurance industries and pharmaceutical industries. I don't take money from either of them because they stand in the way of progress. And as we're shaping what looks like the future of rural healthcare in Minnesota, let's talk about access too, and the fact that healthcare is a matter of minutes. And what's near you isn't close enough in southern Minnesota, because that has to be raised too. And these are the ideas that I'm going to represent and bring to Congress. My opponent likes to talk about ideas around socialized Medicare or socialized healthcare and things like that. He misrepresents me at every turn to the point that I'm not sure whether he's lying or simply doesn't understand the concepts in the first place. Either one is disqualifying, because people's health relies on this. Our future as an economy relies on whether or not we are healthy, whether or not we are deciding to become our own doctors. We're in a place right now where every young person I talk to, if they're lucky enough to be on their parents' health insurance, is terrified of turning 26. We're in a place right now where so many people I talk to can't wait to turn 65 years old so they can be on Medicare. It's the strangest phenomenon. People can't wait to turn 65. That is a broken system. I don't accept it. I want to move forward because I don't accept the idea that what we had before works, and I don't accept the status quo.
Well, here you have it. The people that said, keep your doctor, keep your plan, save $2,500 a year, are the ones that are telling us that the system's broken. We're living under your system. Everybody's dealing with your system, and it's broken, it's broken, it's broken. Now, Dan says we should move towards a system of whatever you want to call it, like they have in foreign countries. I think he's talking about Canada, Germany, Great Britain. And folks, one way or another, that's socialized medicine. And if you talk about a public option and everybody buying into Medicare and everything like that, you know what that means? That means doctors and hospitals in this country are reimbursed at 50 cents on the dollar. Not a dollar on the dollar when you, as somebody that might have private insurance, goes in and pays. 50 cents on the dollar. That model doesn't work. It doesn't work for the Mayo Clinic. It doesn't work for the Mankato Clinic. It doesn't work for any clinic in the long run, whether you're in an urban area or not in an urban area like our rural communities, our rural hospitals. And think about that. Every day, I just talked to a pilot who flies from the route from Minneapolis to Rochester. That's his deal. He says every flight is overbooked. Every flight, about a third of the people coming in are from foreign countries. Now, why is that? They just like the weather in Rochester? I don't know. They're wonderful people there. A lot of good things to do. They're there for the finest quality medical care in all the world. They'll fly in from all these countries around the world that have these great systems that Dan wants, where they're on waiting lists and everything else, and they come here for care. And if you start reimbursing doctors and hospitals at 50 cents on the dollar, including Mayo, you know what happens? That whole model comes to an end. The economic opportunity and all the wonders that are going on in and around Rochester, places like Mankato are at risk. Businesses dry up, schools dry up. The 40,000 jobs in this district tied to the Mayo Clinic and medicine go down the tubes along with their benefits. And your taxes, by the way, through the roof, because that system he talks about, $32 trillion. You think the debt's now big and he doesn't like the tax bill. Wait till they implement that on you.
That was a good example. Is that right? There we go. That was a good example of either misrepresenting, either through lying or doesn't understand the differences in these terms, and throwing them out like they're interchangeable. And that shows me someone with lacking the intellectual curiosity to actually solve this. He likes to bring up arguments a lot from 2010, which is understandable, because that's how long he's been running for Congress here. That's an important distinction to bring this conversation. Let's talk about a different future here. I don't accept the status quo. Let's talk about a future in which the Mayo Clinic, which is the forefront of health research and health care, becomes a part of a transformative system in which people seek preventative care. The Mayo Clinic is the partner to have that conversation, that can be the leader and part of this. That's the partnership I want to have with them, so that we adhere to that medical principle, do no harm, and we become the transformative change right here in southern Minnesota.
Following up on healthcare questions, there's a number of questions from the audience that talk about prescription drug prices and getting around the question of, do you support letting Medicare negotiate with prescription drug companies? Or if not, how would you lower the cost of prescription drugs?
Yes, absolutely. It has to happen. The VA is allowed to do this. Why not let Medicare be allowed to do it too? These are one of the dynamics that we didn't cover in any of this conversation so far, the rising costs of prescription drugs. Again, one of these functions in which people, when they seek medical care, that they realize just how much it costs to actually treat themselves along the way. That absolutely has to be a priority in Congress, and will only do so if members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, aren't taking money from Big Pharma that prevents you from even having the discussion in the first place.
Let's just get this out of the way. There is no such thing as taking corporate PAC money. It would be against the law. It's illegal, Dan. Nobody takes corporate PAC money. So, figure that. Talking about deception, all right? So he runs ads on that, corporate PAC money. It's against the law. I mean, if you think we're breaking the law, please, file something. Here's where we are in prescription drugs. The system that we have in place right now in the United States with our innovative technologies and businesses and everything is very good in this respect. We're producing some enormously important and successful drugs and therapies that are helping people live longer lives and helping people live better lives. That process that they go through at the FDA is very intensive, probably too long. I actually had this conversation with the President of the United States just in the last week and a half when he was in town in Rochester. And he said they're going to try and cut that in half and do some things in order to lower costs for companies so that prices of drugs can be lowered. But yes, I mean, if you're going to have a system where the government is involved, obviously they can negotiate. The president's looked at that. The administration, the Republicans have many bills on this. The regulatory process is very onerous and drives up costs. And, if you want to look at what we should do, Congressman Gutnick, who used to hold the seat, who supports me here for this race, he used to have an idea that if you produce drugs in the United States, prescription drugs, and you sell them overseas, well, then you have to sell them in the United States for the same price that you charge the folks overseas. Why should we be subsidizing the rest of the world, including the Canadians and others? That was something to look at. So I'm open to all of it. Nobody's taking corporate PAC money. It's against the law. And as far as running for this seat multiple times, I wear that like a badge of honor. I've been out here working for 5 years, meeting every last person I can, letting you know what I stand for. We walked 350 miles of parade, shaking hands. It's like starting in South Dakota, crisscrossing I-90 all the way to Wisconsin, turning around, going to Rochester. We've been meeting with thought leaders in all 21 counties to find out what's going on. I will say this, Colin Peterson ran 5 times, John Klein 3, Newt Gingrich 3. I'm not alone in this. But having gotten to this point, if you're kind enough to give me the opportunity to represent you in Congress, I will be in a much better position to represent the people because we've made these great connections over the years. Thank you.
Well, clearly some differences on health care. Maybe we can talk about an issue that everyone agrees on, immigration, right? I mean, that's... No disagreement there, right? So immigration. A July 2018 Gallup poll found that 22% of Americans rank immigration as the most important problem facing the country. This obviously reflects President Trump's continued focus on illegal immigration and the administration's often controversial policies designed to deal with the issue. What, in your view, is the right path for the nation to take on immigration? And Mr. Hagedorn, you're first.
This issue is going to offer you a clear choice in this election. I believe that America's borders need to be secured. And that means a number of things, a wall, a fence, whatever we have to do at the southern border to make sure it's secured so people who shouldn't be coming into the United States along with drugs and everything else stays out as best as possible, and we put our Border Patrol in a position where they can do their job as effectively as possible. Second, though, we have to make sure that people who fly into the country and overstay temporary visas, well, we have a passport and visa system that can identify them. We round them up, get them out of the country. They shouldn't be here. There are 5 million people in the United States illegally today who did that. Some are from terrorist countries. Some could be people like on 9/11 that caused us problems. And if you think, oh, what are we worried about? Well, remember on 9/11, it only took 19 people to do that destruction. That was a disaster of all disasters for our country, economically, physically, just the loss of life, psychologically. Terrible. We can't allow that to happen. We have to protect the country. I also support a timeout on refugees and enhanced vetting to make sure that we're bringing people into the United States that will assimilate and have every chance, I think, to blend into our culture and not cause terrorism, assimilation, and welfare problems. I actually came up with that idea before President Trump in the campaign, because Minnesota had problems in those areas from refugees coming from countries predominantly that hate America. But what we also need is a merit-based system of immigration. A merit-based system of immigration means forget about this chain migration where they come here just because they're all relatives. It means we decide who comes into the United States because we have some sense that the folks are going to fill a needed job, they're going to have some skills, they're going to contribute to the economy, that they will assimilate and become part of the fabric of America. The United States is the most generous country in the world in allowing legal immigration. Over 1 million times a year, we bring people to our country to join us. There's something like 50 to 60 million people in the United States right now, foreign born. So it isn't as though we've been, Scrooges about this. We've been really good, and we should celebrate that. But we should make sure going forward that we do the right thing. I also believe we need to end these sanctuary cities and sanctuary politics. Walz wants to make us a sanctuary state. That's going to bring in people from a 10-state region, going to drive up our crime, our cost, and everything else. Dan supports that policy. It's a bad idea. And lastly, we need a work program so people can come here and fill needed jobs. We can help the folks in farming, agriculture, other businesses, make sure our economy moves forward. People can, in that program, let them stay or go as they please. They can travel back and forth, or maybe build up credits towards citizenship so they can become citizens of the United States. That's my plan on immigration. From Dan, I think you're going to hear something far different.
It's fascinating in the conversation I hear, no matter what part of the political spectrum you are, the agreement on the brokenness of the immigration system and how it represents in southern Minnesota in truly unique challenges, including one that we all have to confront going to the future. Where are we going to get people from? This is a vexing problem for us right now. We are a place with low unemployment, but we are a place that needs to make sure that every southern Minnesota kid understands the opportunities in front of them, but also make sure that we take advantage of the human capital, the power of that potential that it has that's right here and now. And when we talk about a broken immigration system, the ones bearing the brunt of it right now are our small business owners. There are mayors, there are law enforcement who are struggling to understand what exactly our system is, and they're the ones having to make up policy on account of that. I don't accept it, because comprehensive immigration reform is a bipartisan idea. And that means the concept where if you are working hard, you are paying taxes here, there should be a pathway to citizenship for you. If you are a dreamer, there should be a pathway to citizenship for you. And if you are part of a guest worker program, that should be an opportunity for you to be part of our economy and part of our fabric that is right here. It isn't based on fear. It's the idea of what Minnesota is. It's the idea that both Jim and my ancestors immigrated here to southern Minnesota in search of opportunity, and we were able to welcome them. And this wasn't this question of assimilation. It was this question of where can you find an opportunity? It's our job to make sure that exists and that is there. If we want to have a conversation about border security, I'm happy to talk about my 2 tours in Iraq. I'm happy to talk about the time I've spent keeping this country safe, because that's a conversation we should have. And I'd be happy to have that conversation with President Trump, because whoever's advising him on the topic right now is missing the bigger picture, is missing how complicated the threats are that face this country every single day. And it's not about the idea of a wall on the southern border alone. They are complex. They are through cyberspace. They are bioterrorism. They are multifaceted, and they have to have people thinking about them in the broadest sense. And we are being misled if we are told everything can be solved with a simple wall, because that's not the case. Because at the end of the day, the comprehensive immigration reform that has to happen is a matter of our future right here. I hear that from pork producers, I hear that from our small business owners, and I hear that from people that are already a part of our community right here and now.
Right. I don't question I don't question Dan's service in the military. I think it's wonderful. We honor it, Dan. But this is a political discussion, and I think on this particular issue, the positions that you take for open borders, amnesty, sanctuary politics, those are not things that are going to make us safe and secure and improve our country. I think those are things that are going to make us less safe and vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons that the Fraternal Order of the police officers support me, because I know they're going to work with them. I want them to be in a position they can do their job, keep the community safe. We don't add to the problems that they have. This deal, which way we go. He votes for Pelosi and a Democrat, And you're putting in charge people who are going to try to make sure that we no longer have ICE, that the agents aren't out there arresting and deporting illegal aliens. And I've asked him many times in these debates, when do you believe that ICE agents should do their job? When should people be deported from the United States? He won't answer. And I just say we have to support them, let them do their job, and make sure that we administer the immigration laws in the United States and get back to the rule of law. That's where I stand.
But that's just it. Again, when I talk to mayors, when I talk to local law enforcement, figuring out what the law is right now is on their shoulders. The system is broken, and they are trying to figure it out. And if you want to talk about an organization like ICE, I'm happy to do so right now, because that's also an organization struggling to understand the system within which it's supposed to operate right now. That's another example, because again, all of this starts with the abdication of leadership from a U.S. Congress to pass bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform. That's what has to happen, so that the burden of all of this gets off of people who need to be empowered to live their best lives.
I'd like to move on to a question about veterans. Mankato is home to a VA clinic. Given recent publicity about problems at the Department of Veteran Affairs, what changes do you believe can be implemented to improve the system of health care for veterans?
Yes, this is an issue obviously deeply personal to me, but I also think about the perspective I have on policymaking. We as a country tend to rush into war time and time again and then do very little to help veterans on the back end of things. And this era of war in which we are at 17 straight years is a place that we're at as a part of it right now. I have many friends that have sought VA care over the last 10 years. Some of them have had incredible experiences with it, some haven't. And that inconsistency, in my view, is a result of a Congress that hasn't been involved in this enough. And when you think about that, that's that role of Congress to set the VA up for success. It's also the role of Congress to make sure the VA right now, which has 18,000 vacancies across its systems, actually hires the people there to be empowered to do their jobs, so that when someone comes in from care, they're actually addressed, they're actually met, and it's not one person doing the work of three, which is the status quo right now. But in a larger sense than this, let's talk about being proactive in veterans' health care, not just admitting well after the fact the health concerns that come out of things like we did in Vietnam with Agent Orange. Let's talk about burn pits right here and now in a way that admits that there are wounds from war that we don't anticipate, that have to be part of it. Let's fully fund TBI research, that's traumatic brain injury, because that is one of the wounds of this war that we have not confronted in full. Let's talk about the role of amputations. Let's talk about the role that PTSD still plays on a broader part of the society, because all of these things we pay lip service to. We don't actually deliver on it. But that's the potential that the VA has. These are unique healthcare concerns that veterans have. And veterans absolutely do have a choice to use that system or not use that system. But that system has to be there. It has to be fully funded. And there has to be someone hired who's greeting you when you come in along the way. But there's one other point that we have to make too. I'd love to see who in this crowd right now knows that the war in Afghanistan turned 17 years old last week. 17 years. So in military terms, the war in Afghanistan itself is old enough to enlist with its parents' support. Think about that. Think about the cost that we put into war along the way. If you ended the war on terror right now, factoring everything in, including the costs of veterans' health care along the way, $5 trillion. Thousands of American lives, untold amount of civilian lives along the way. This, in anything, this is a criticism I have of my own party and the Republican Party, an unwillingness of Congress to shoulder the burden of answering a very simple question: should we be at war? They gave a blank check in 2001 to do so. And veterans did so because they signed up to serve in the first place. Congress has to shoulder that burden, because I don't accept the fact that my own son could fight in the same war that I did at the end of the day. That's the biggest thing we can do to impact veterans' health care, is to stop sending veterans into foreign wars in a perpetual state.
I called for the end of the Afghan war in 2014 when I was running against Walz and put that out there. We haven't changed our position. I mean, you were a political appointee in the Obama administration. You were there. Did you do anything about it? Did you tell the president you need to get out of Afghanistan? Bad idea, Mr. President? Because just because Congress authorizes something Doesn't mean that the troops are going overseas. That's the prerogative of the President of the United States. Your president let them stay there for another 8 years. Now Trump's in office and you want to go after him. I get it. Here's what's going on with the VA and vets. I think it's pretty simple. I believe too many of them fall through the cracks. Too many of them have to go long distances. Too many of them don't have choice, still. And I've said this from the very beginning. It's probably the most liberal position I've ever taken in my life. I believe that every veteran in the United States should be empowered to choose their own doctors and hospitals, and I believe the taxpayers should pay for it. I truly believe that. I think they go out there and they put everything on the line, and they come back and they deserve that, and they deserve to be treated properly. A couple of things that I've learned along the way leads me to that conclusion. I met a fella at the Rice County Fair 3 years ago. So yeah, you're out here campaigning, but we meet people. And he saw in my literature that I wanted the vets to be able to choose their own doctors and hospitals. And he said, does that count for psychiatrists as well? I said, of course. He said, that's good. I sure wish we had had that policy before. And I said, why? He says, because my friend could have used it. I said, what happened with your friend? He said, well, he called the VA, had some issues, and they said, we're full up. Call us back. He went out and unfortunately committed suicide. This was a conversation we had at the Republican booth at the Rice County Fair. That kind of got me. I said, everybody deserves to be heard. Everybody deserves the chance. We should open it up. I see my friend up here, Joe Steck, running for state representative. I don't think he'll mind me telling the story, but about a year ago, he was in a VA hospital up in Minneapolis. I visited him. He had triple bypass surgery. By all accounts, I think they did a good job. And I'm not saying there aren't good people working in the VA and good doctors and nurses and technicians. There are. But people need to have an option when they fall through the cracks. And Joe was told for many, many months that he was having panic attacks by his VA physician, by the technicians and others there. And he just took it, didn't go for a second opinion, whatever. It wasn't open to him. Turned out he was having heart attacks or having the precursors to heart attacks, and he's this close to death. Very lucky he's here today. We're happy as heck that he's here today. All I can tell you is that people's lives are on the line, and they deserve that opportunity to go and have choice. And I'll leave you one last thing. I don't want to be overly partisan, but I really believe in that last administration, they did not make veterans a priority. Too many veterans died at the hands of the U.S. government, and that's just my opinion. It's also something that I've learned along the way from someone who is very knowledgeable in the subject.
I'm sure you want to respond. Let me ask this question since it leads right into what you're going to talk about, and that is this issue of foreign policy and sort of domestic terrorism. So what, in your view, are the biggest threats facing the country from the perspective of foreign policy, and how would you seek to address them in Congress?
Yeah, it's tough for me to sit and listen to that without needing to raise a point here, because when I think about my opponent, we're going to have disagreements on things, but what I think speaks the most about you is your character and the things that you say and the things that you state. While I was overseas in Iraq, my opponent was writing a blog. And in that blog, he wrote a lot of things, as was his freedom to do, as was the freedom I was fighting for allowing him to do just that. But he wrote about women a lot in derogatory terms, and he wrote about veterans as well. And he wrote about a triple amputee and calling him a half soldier. And he wrote about telling them to roll away. And I think that tells you everything. He might say it's a joke. So either veterans aren't something to be taken seriously, or they're a joke. One or two. I don't accept that idea. And he doesn't have to have served to be able to do it, but you have to be able to do so with a straight face. Because I fought for the freedom for him to say those things, but I don't believe that qualifies him to be able to represent in Congress. Because this is personal to me, and it's personal to veterans all around southern Minnesota. There's 40,000 of them. No two political viewpoints the same. But the idea of respecting of one's service is the idea of the social contract we're all in. Some serve for the benefit of many. That's the idea of it, regardless of political ideology. So I want to make sure that's very clear on this, because this is one of the things I believe makes Mr. Hagedorn disqualified for serving in office, because those are the issues in front of you. Because when we talk about foreign policy, and here's the greatest challenge to foreign policy right now, and I can speak to this because I spoke about this in my role in the Pentagon, where I implored the Secretary of Defense multiple times that what was happening to our military was hurting it. And that's the idea across both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. The greatest threat to national security right now in foreign policy terms is that our military has been fighting for 17 straight years. When you ask the Air Force, and some of you seen an advertisement of me talking about the different military branches, what I was actually talking about in that moment was talking about advocating for fully funding the Air Force to a larger extent. Because our Air Force right now has been dropping bombs over Afghanistan for 17 straight years. That's an entire generation of pilots who haven't been dogfighting, who haven't been learning those higher-end skills they have to do if our country was ever under full attack. That's a threat to it, because our military is not nearly as ready as we need it to be. And this isn't a matter of how strong the military is going to be. That's a generic, terrible term. This isn't a matter of how large it is. We as a country just keep using it over and over again. And I believe every president will continue to do so in that realm, because it is Congress's role, per the Constitution, to authorize the use of force. And I am someone who's willing to stand up, whether it's in front of my party or against my party, I don't care, to be able to say enough and to shoulder the burden and answer that question so that I can be able to answer any mother and father here in southern Minnesota and tell them why or why not it was right for their son or daughter to die in service.
Yeah, I understand he's brought this up before. In 2002, he's right. I was talking about a liberal senator, Cleveland, and I said, I actually called him a hero. That was the first thing that I said. But, and then there was a quote from a Clint Eastwood movie. That's what it was. So, you know, I've apologized for that, and I think it was wrong. But if you think that's how I feel about all veterans, you don't know me. And we've been out here crisscrossing southern Minnesota, you know, shaking 250,000 hands, many veterans, and I have many supporters and friends who are veterans. And I think I'll leave it to the folks of southern Minnesota who have gotten to know me personally to make their own determinations. But as far as what the threats are for the country, you know, obviously, you don't want nuclear warheads falling on your country. So the biggest threat to us would be probably countries in that regard. China, Russia, even North Korea, others, Iran, if they're allowed to get a weapon. And so I think what's been going on for the last even 2 administrations is we've seen weakness. The positions of China and Russia have been much stronger compared to our country over the last 16 or so years. And North Korea, that can got kicked down the road how many different ways, right? And we finally have an administration and a president that's standing up to these characters, wants to go after China. You know, when you and Barack Obama were in office, they're building islands over there, filling in places with sand, put us at risk to expand their forces. That wasn't good. In Russia, and you guys on the left will laugh, but honestly, one of the strongest things that we've done to undermine Russia is to build up our own energy economy so we can export natural gas and things like that, because the Russian economy is a one-trick pony, putting a lot of pressure on them, making it difficult for them to have a lot of wealth to do these things. And then you look at North Korea. I remember when President Trump said he was going to negotiate and just start doing some things with North Korea, and everyone on the left started yelling, oh, he's going to get us a new nuclear war. It's terrible. Look what's going to happen. 6 months later, he's sitting down with them, and the same people are going, oh, he gave away the store. What's going on? You know, he's negotiating. He's working. He's standing up to our adversaries. He's standing with our allies. Things are going well. The other threat is from Islam, radical Islam, Islamic supremacy. It hasn't been in the news as much lately for a reason. You know, when President Obama pulled the troops out of Iraq, probably before we were ready, we didn't have a status of forces agreement in place to make sure that we could keep the peace, created a vacuum. What happened? Filled by ISIS. Major problems. We were told it'll be generations before we can get ISIS under control. President Trump comes in, gets rid of those ridiculous rules of engagement, allows people to go in there and do their job, and guess what? Nobody even writes articles about ISIS anymore. I'm sure they're still a threat. I'm sure they're still out there. We're not even talking about them anymore. That's in a year and a half. We're making great progress. President Trump and the Republicans were dealt a bad hand by Obama and the left. When Obama left the presidency, he had the whole Middle East on fire, needlessly. Went in there and undermined Egypt, our friend. So the Muslim Brotherhood took over. Luckily, the military came in and wiped them out. Yemen, same problem. Undermined our friend. Libya, you talk about needless wars. Hillary Clinton's war against Gaddafi. Gaddafi hadn't caused his problems in 25 years. He was a neutral actor. They go in there and undermine a thing. The whole place is on fire. Refugees going all over the place. And on refugees, what we need are safe zones for them so we can repatriate them to their home countries. But I do stand for a refugee timeout. And I do stand for enhanced vetting. And Dan said at the time, President Trump's policy is going to make us less safe. How? I don't quite get that one.
Yeah, I'd happily address that last point because it serves a larger purpose too. When we engage in perpetual war with an all-volunteer force that is less than 1% of this country, that is an enormous burden for them to shoulder. And a lot of people like to make the argument we should just grow, we should just make it bigger. That's a very hard thing to do. Most people in this country don't want to serve in the military, and many are disqualified from doing so because of physical fitness. It's a very hard thing to do. So when we talk about making the country less safe, this is, again, I talked about those Air Force pilots. Those are missions again and again and again where they're doing a very simple task, where they are prevented from doing that higher order training that we need to have happen if we were ever to be under attack, if we ever needed to execute any of our war plans. That has to be there. Why does this matter? Because I agreed with President Trump on the campaign trail. I was encouraged by the idea that he was going to take a very hard look at this and be able to do something different about it. But as soon as he got to office, he doubled down on it yet again, and that's the policy. And why this matters? My opponent talked about how he viewed this 2 years ago. Fine, great. But he changed his tune just as well. And this demonstrates the point. It's either a rubber stamp for the Trump administration or it's a check and balance. And this is one area that it has to be that check and balance so that we are pushing that executive branch to try to end wars, not keep them going on and on.
I haven't changed my positions. We should not be undermining stable actors in the Middle East and other places like Hillary did with Gaddafi and even Bush did in Iraq. I mean, I'm the first one to come back and say those things. We learned some lessons there. We need stability and people that are going to help us keep the peace or help us keep the free flow of oil, make sure they can be as benevolent to their people as possible and so forth. I'm not for war. I'm not big on it. I'm a Reagan peace through strength guy. I saw the President of the United States dismantle the Soviet Union without firing a shot. That's the model that we should be following. Now, you know, the one thing is, you have some experience in this, Dan. He was a political appointee with Barack Obama in the readiness part of the Pentagon, in the military. And you know what? If there's one place when the Obama administration left office that we had complete failure, it was the readiness arm of the military. They left the military in a state of disrepair not seen since Jimmy Carter. Thank goodness Trump is trying to rebuild it and get things put back together. Excuse me, back together. And one of the things that Dan did, and he never talks about this, I think it's just remarkable. He actually accomplished something out there with Obama, and he never talks about it. I haven't heard him talk about it in one speech. He was part of the group that said, what we need to do for the military is have social experimentation and have open transgendered service in the military. Now, he takes that position, but I don't see how that helps us become more ready and prepared to fight. And I have yet to meet a veteran in this district who thinks that that was a good idea.
30 seconds and we'll move on.
Yeah, I think this highlights this a very clear, important distinction. I'm ready to hit the ground running. I'm ready to continue to do what I've done my whole life to keep this country safe, which includes making sure our military is the best in the world. And that includes making sure that people want to join our military in the first place. And that means continuing the proud tradition we have of our best and brightest being able to do so in the first place. A tradition that's right here in southern Minnesota, when the 1st Minnesota served in the Civil War. That's the idea of who we are. But if we aren't doing everything possible, I already talked to you about how challenging it is to recruit into the military, then we all lose out. Because as long as war continues and perpetuates, young people in particular, are disinclined to join in the first place. Mr. Hagedorn has run for Congress now 4 times. And if this is a distinction that he understands, there's real power that the Congress has along these veins. And I am frustrated to think of the approach that he would take in the first place.
I'd like to ask about government service and military service because it is an all-volunteer force now. Do either of you think we should have mandatory government or military service of 1 or 2 years like other countries do? And if so, what do you think that would look like?
I would oppose that position.
Why?
Because I think the all-volunteer forces work very well, and I honestly don't believe that Americans should be forced into doing anything that they don't want to do. And plus, Now, let's face it, if we had a situation where we had an emergency or war or whatever, and we had to change our opinion of that, of course, I would be flexible and change my opinion. But I think it's worked very well. I think people have to make their own choices, decide what they want to do. It's wonderful when people decide to go and serve in our military. We honor their service, and we support them every step of the way. But if people have a different choice, they want to open up a business, become a farmer, they want to become a nurse, whatever, it should be their choice. And then also there's some incentives. If it's an all-volunteer force, then we have a government that needs to put in place policies that are going to attract people into that. Make sure that we have a strong military, we have weapon systems second to none, that we do treat our soldiers and pay them properly. And if there's one part that I'd like to see different in the Pentagon, it's I think that's the first agency of government that should be reformed. They should all be reformed. But every agency has its waste, fraud, and abuse. Every agency can be reorganized to save money. I think we could probably save upwards of 10% of the budget of the Pentagon. Now, I would not take it out of the Pentagon. I would reinvest it into weapon systems and pay for the troops. But I'd like to see that done. But no, I don't support that concept.
So I think about my own perspective of what service has taught me along the way. It's the idea, again, we talked about this at the beginning, the idea of working with people that you might not meet otherwise. And when you think about a time as divided as 2018 feels like, I think this is a concept that we should talk about. But I also like to think about policy is never in isolation. So I like to talk about it in a different way. It's not the idea of mandatory service, but the idea of tying programs of service, doesn't have to be military, there's going to be a broad definition to it, to the rising costs of 2- and 4-year colleges along the way. Because if we create a system of incentives whereby people enter into, whether it's a year of service, 2 years of service, and that can look like a lot of different things. It's a program like City Year, it could be the military. Then our young people are exposed to things that, again, they wouldn't be exposed to otherwise, and can get a financial incentive to reduce the burdensome cost that college puts on people right now. And this is a concept we tried to model through the campaign, too. When I look across a very divided political time that 2018 is, one of the things we've done since the beginning is this idea of service Saturdays. We did one right here in Mankato last fall where we rake leaves. It's a service project. So get out there and do it. And it's with the idea, every time I say it, I don't care if you voted, I don't care who you voted for, come out and do it. Because there's challenges in our country that can be solved through the concept of service. And if we continue to promote that idea among a younger generation, then that lasts a lifetime. There's power in it. And it's not the idea, it's apolitical. Because the work's got to get done. It's a matter of people stepping forward with the right incentive to do it, whether that's out of the motivation of your heart or the fact and reality of the challenges young people face with the rising costs of things like education.
All right, turning to another audience-submitted question. With the growing number of states decriminalizing and legalizing recreational use of marijuana, the federal government has remained steadfast in its view that it remains a federally banned substance. Would you support federal legislation to reclassify marijuana and leave it up to individual states to determine its legality? And Mr. Feehan, goes to you first.
Yes, first and foremost. But the idea right now, this is the system we're living in. Minnesota will face this choice with the next governor as well. When you look at the system right now as it is, and we talked about law enforcement a little bit right now, law enforcement is overburdened with the tasks at hand. They become the default for everything. Mental health, low nonviolent drug offenses. They become the default and the burden for it. And this is one of many ways in which we can lift that burden. And I think it's far time to be able to look at this in particular. And it's not just about the freedom that comes with it too. It's about the medical use of marijuana as well. Something that the VA right now cannot research per design of this current administration. That's something we absolutely have to lean into, because the benefits of that compared to a system right now in which veterans are overprescribed medications, this is an absolute avenue that we have to explore.
I do not support the legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes. And if you think the police are overwhelmed now, wait till you do that, and they're going to have even more problems at their hands. So, you know, we get across the district and we met with people. We referred to them as our thought leaders. And we'd go into each of the counties and we'd talk to city administrators, county administrators. We'd talk to social workers, mayors, and also sheriffs and chiefs of police and others. And the chiefs of police and the sheriffs all told me the same thing, because I asked every last one of them their opinion of this. Should we do it? You say that you're trying to help them. It's not what they want. They said that the marijuana of today, as compared to when many of us were in college or in the younger days, is probably 10 times stronger than that. and that these drugs get to a point where they are a gateway because people need to get to a certain point, and if they don't continue to get that high, they go to something else. And every last one of these police chiefs and others will tell you, bad idea, hurting people, causing lots of problems. They end up moving up the ladder to other problems, fentanyl patches and the rest of it, and it just continues to be a problem. As far as medical marijuana, things of that nature, we're open to it. I know that the states have a role here. The federal government at this point doesn't allow it. People have talked about industrial hemp because that doesn't have some of the effects as traditional marijuana, but can still give some of the pain relief. I'm open to looking at those types of things, but as far as legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes, I do not support that.
Another audience submitted question. Do you recognize the science of man-made climate change? If not, why not?
Okay, this is like the fourth time we've had this debate. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to talk about climate change. And you know, climate change used to be global warming, and before that it was acid rain, and before that, they thought we were having an ice age. So like every 10 years they change it into something different. Here's the deal. Whether you believe that there is so-called climate change man-made or not, it really doesn't matter. The whole point is, if you believe it, what are you going to do about it? And for, you know, a bunch of times in our debates, I'd keep saying, what are your proposals? You know, Dan will walk through parades with a sign that says, act on climate change. But he never really comes out and tells people exactly what he's going to do about it, what policies he's going to support, and more importantly, how much those policies would cost you. Now, here's what I believe. The earth has been heating and cooling since God created it. I believe that there's been climate change forever. Whether or not it's man-made or not, I don't believe it makes a difference because the proposals that are out there aren't going to solve the problem, and I believe there are other ways to address the problem than transforming our energy sector and turning our economy upside down. The ideas that they have out there, carbon tax, cap and trade, regulations against fracking and methane, all these the Paris Climate Accords. What that does is it drives up the cost of every product and service in the country. It makes us less affluent, and it takes power from the United States economy and it transfers it across the world to our adversaries in trading, people like China, Russia, Brazil, and so forth, India. Here's my policy on energy. U.S. energy independence led by an all-of-the-above approach. That includes everything. Make sure that we have the pipelines, the distribution points, and the refineries in place so we can utilize in an efficient way the energy resources that we have in the United States. And we have the most energy resources of any country on earth. In the end, we want to have abundant, reliable, affordable U.S. energy. That's what's good for farmers. That's what's good for manufacturers. That's what's good for consumers. That's what's good for truckers. That's what's good for everybody in the United States, to keep the downward pressure on the cost of energy. You know, I just reading a thing about, hey, the price at the pump on gas is higher than we'd like it to be. And one of the problems is we haven't been building the pipelines needed in order to efficiently move our oil. We're up over 10 million barrels of oil every day in the United States. That's good. We could be producing more, but we can't refine it, we can't transport it, and so forth. And one of the reasons that the L is disappearing from the DFL in this state is because they no longer like labor. They're not for these projects like pipelines and so forth. And I'd ask my friend, do you support the Enbridge pipeline, the Enbridge 3? Do you support Keystone? What are you for? But I think in the end, what I'm for is abundant, reliable, affordable U.S. energy and to keep our economy moving the right direction.
So I'd like to make a broader point, and then let's talk about climate change with it. So if my opponent's willing to look at science, to look at facts, and disregard it and say, I don't believe it, in this area, then it makes sense to think that that's what he's going to do in every area. And the whole point of Congress is to make evidence-driven policy. I don't know why you can pick and choose which areas you believe or don't. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of science in the first place. It is fact-driven. It is ration-driven. That's the point. You can demonstrate causation. That's why thought leaders for generations now, that's why the Pentagon that I worked in since the 1970s has called this a long-term national security threat. That's why the current Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs call it the greatest long-term security threat that our country is facing. But it's not some far-flung idea of a coastline somewhere else. It's right here in southern Minnesota. It's right here in the idea that our harvest this year is going to be late again, and that rain events keep happening with a greater and greater change in what's normal. It's the reality that in southeast Minnesota right now, there is no more Hoka Falls. It doesn't exist anymore because it was wiped off the face of the earth. It's gone. That's the reality of climate change right here now. So yeah, the question of what you're going to do about it, you have to react to it. And that starts with our ag economy, this driving question for us right here and now, because we have to make sure that our crops are resilient, and that means research. That means an investment in land-grant universities. I sat next to my opponent at FarmFest, and he didn't understand the question when asked about land-grant universities. Well, here's a great way that they can make sure we're having an impact of what we can do about it right here and now. Let's become not energy independent as a country. Let's become energy independent right here in southern Minnesota and promote our solar and our wind and our biofuels because they're renewable and they're right here. That's the strength of our economy. And what can we do in a larger sense? The biggest thing that I wanted to happen was the Paris Climate Accords. But the President of the United States decided we were going to opt out as a country. I'm going to advocate everything I can to make sure we can try to opt back in, because I even think President Trump would be open to hearing a different argument. But if we're not, then Congress has to be able to react in the first place to do it. But the idea of thinking globally and acting locally applies here, because southern Minnesota has to be leading the way just as we have for generations.
You know, wants to become energy, wants to be
Great clappers, but let's listen to the candidates instead of ourselves, huh?
wants to become energy independent, and the United States is energy independent except for one source, crude oil. The only way we're going to become energy independent in the foreseeable future is to drill for more crude oil. Unless everybody's going to start, using battery-powered combines and battery-powered trucks and battery-powered this and that. It's not going to happen. So for now, for the foreseeable future, we have to continue to move our economy forward. He says, well, we have to act on the policy. And yet he doesn't tell you. Doesn't tell you what he supports. He does support a carbon tax, because that's the way they're going to get there. He does support the clean power plan that Obama put out there. He does support cap and trade and the environmental movement in that area. He does support a regulation against fracking and methane and things like that. One of the ideas that I have for a more cleaner environment, let's keep moving towards natural gas for trucks, light trucks, especially those that make deliveries every day. Very important. If there's a place for the federal government, maybe it's to facilitate, to make sure we have fueling stations, to get that thing undergoing. But you know how we're going to have enough natural gas, particularly at a cheap price? In order to make that happen, we're going to have to go out and frack. We're going to have to go out and drill. We're going to have to use the energy resources of the United States. And frankly, the only climate that's going to be changed by Dan Feehan and the liberal left's ideas is the jobs, the business, the agriculture, climate, and everybody else's climate as far as our economy is concerned, and not for the best.
All right. We have about 8 minutes left, so let's do one round of quick questions, and we'll get to closing statements. And I think the final question I want to ask is, if you're fortunate enough to get elected, what is the very first bill you're going to introduce as a congressman from the 1st District? And I think we start with you.
So if I have the honor of getting elected, you think about what Congress is right now, and let's think about the dynamics. No matter what happens on November 6th, the Congress is still going to be pretty sharply divided along party lines. And so first, before we talk about legislation, let's talk about approach. Because what I learned in federal policy making, that there's a good way of doing it and a not so good way of doing it. The not so good way is simple. You come up with an idea, you think it's great, and then you go to the people you know are going to agree with you on it. And that tends to be within your own party. And when you do that, you don't talk to the other side. You don't talk to the other side until it's way too late, until the stakes are too high, and then nothing gets done. That is the status quo right now in Washington. The other way of doing it is how I learned to do it in the Pentagon. When I came up with an idea, I resisted that urge. Instead, I went to the person first that I knew would disagree with me. And you learn a couple of things along the way. You learn that your ideas aren't as good as you think they are. That's a reality of life. And then you humanize each other. You humanize each other on that other side before the stakes are too high, before that inaction happens, and before everyone just says, I'm not going to give. I'm someone who believes in the idea of principle-driven policymaking. I won't compromise on the principles here at hand, but I will compromise on how you can get there. And that's what has to be a part of Washington, D.C. right now. It is broken because that does not exist. And I, for one, am willing to make that leap across the other side, because it is that hyper-partisanship, it is that broken process that gets us what we get right now. So let's talk about healthcare as a concept for first legislation here. Because in the idea of healthcare right now, we have people with rising costs and rising costs and rising costs. And when I talk about the idea of a public option, I believe it's a bipartisan idea. It may not be shared by my opponent, but I believe that there are Republicans across the aisle who would believe in the idea that we should look at it, that we should find a relief for the people on the individual market right now who cannot afford these costs any longer. And that's what I would hope the chance to be able to introduce if lucky enough to be elected.
All right. Mr. Hagedorn, first bill. Let's
I have a little experience. When I worked at Treasury, I actually worked with Congress to manage bills through the process, 3 national bills through that reform government. And also working for Congressman Stanglin. Of course, we managed his legislation, but we were in the minority in the 1980s. You know, it wasn't until 1994 anybody ever thought Republicans could control the House. And the bill that I would introduce is the same one that Arlen and I worked on in the 1980s, and that is to reinstate work requirements for welfare. And I'd add job training as well. Work requirements and job training for able-bodied people to make sure that they worked for their welfare, and we pushed them towards self-sufficiency and away from government dependence. It's a very good concept that we've gotten away from, because in the 2009 stimulus bill of Obama, they rescinded all of those, pretty much all those requirements. Now, I remember working for Congressman Stanglin at the time. We were carrying the bill. It was a bipartisan bill. We always worked with Democrats on a lot of things. Charlie Stenholm of Texas was the bipartisan co-author. And we went before the Rules Committee, and we just wanted to take our bill to the floor and get a vote. We knew we were going to lose because the Democrats controlled the House, and that's the way it worked. Arlen went up there and gave this great speech, and the gavel came down from Chairman Claude Pepper, and I said, Arlen, what does that mean? He says, it means we're not going to be able to offer our amendment. That's what it means. You know, I couldn't understand what the chairman said. So we're walking down the hall, going back to the office, and I said to the Congressman, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep fighting and doing all these things and hitting our head against the wall when we know the other side's just going to knock us down? And he said something I'll never forget. He says, Jim, we do it because someday there might be enough like-minded people in this body, including enough Republicans to carry the majority, that we can actually get this idea through. And if we keep carrying it and fighting for it, one day it might happen. And by golly, Newt Gingrich and the Republican Congress did get that done, along with President Clinton grudgingly. And that's why you keep fighting for your ideas. That's why you never give up. And that's why it takes an enormous amount of tenacity, in order to get your bills through the House. And that's what I would take to work for you every day on the job. Thank you.
All right. And Jim, let's have you roll right into your closing statement. I think we're coming up on about 2 minutes left, so we could take about a minute each, and we'll get on our way this evening.
Well, excuse me, my voice is a little hoarse here. America's future is on the ballot, and you're going to elect one of the two of us, and it's going to maybe make the difference in this election. It could come down to just this seat as to who controls the Congress. If the Democrats win and the resistance takes over, they're going to take us far to the left. And they're going to try to impeach the president and work against him every step of the way. I'd like to say, I guess this is a difference between resistance and persistence, if he wants to say, I've been working at this for a while. But if I win, I'll cast that vote for a Republican to move our country, continue it in this right direction, to partner with President Trump and like-minded colleagues to keep America safe with secure borders, to keep our economy rolling by reforming the government, to protect your God-given rights, the right to life, the right to keep and bear arms, and the right to religious freedom. And folks, I'll be on that Ag Committee. I'll be working for you to sustain agriculture and our rural way of life. I humbly ask for your vote. It would be an honor to serve you in Congress. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hagedorn. Mr. Feehan.
Absolutely. Thank you once again to the moderators and to our hosts here, and thank you for engaging in democracy in action today. I hope you saw a contrast tonight, both in substance and in style, because that's what we're hoping to present. I'm honored to share the stage with my opponent, because that's what this process is about, you choosing between it. I'm also spent enough time on the campaign trail to look at the idea that there's two kind of different approaches. There's people running to seek power, and there's people running to seek responsibility. If you're running to seek power, your sole focus is focused on how to keep it. But if you're running to seek responsibility, your sole focus is how to fulfill it, whether or not you voted for me. Because some of you will, some of you won't, and that's okay. That's how this system works. But I'd be honored to take on the responsibility because I think a new generation of leadership needs to be in Washington right now to face the challenges we have, to work with the president when it makes sense and to fight him when it doesn't. We can't take those on alone. It's your voice that has to be there. So vote on November 6th, and I'd be honored to have your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feehan. Thank you all for attending tonight. Vote on November 6th. Thanks to our candidates. Thank you all. Remember to vote November 6th. Early voting is available now. Have a great night.